You guys should see my whole screen now. Okay, so we finished, just scrolling back really quick. We just finished our communication disorders section on Monday, and we got through all of it, which is actually great. So today we're just wrapping up the next section that was combined with this, which is learning disorders. Um, so everything we're talking about this week, so what we talked about Monday, what we'll talk about today, and what we're going to talk about on Friday, I think in a school setting, a lot of these disorders cluster together in that you see a lot of these disorders being talked about in educational settings. So a lot of times school psychologists will be involved. In the academic setting, you'll see special education teachers, support staff. So I think if you're familiar with that realm of education, I think hearing a lot of the disorders that we'll talk about this week, you tend to hear a lot in that setting. So again, I said it Monday, this is not necessarily my forte. I think it's all really interesting, but my personal clinical work and research is not in this stuff. So I'm a little bit short on vignettes for this week, but I think once we start, honestly, after next week, we start doing autism, eating disorders, sleep disorder, feeding disorders, mood, anxiety, trauma, like all of those I do have case vignettes for. So yeah, so that's why this week is short on vignettes. Okay, so we talked about learning disorders and also communication disorders having a lot of overlap in terms of terminology with other disciplines. So with communication disorders, we said there's certainly a lot of overlap with speech language pathology, and they might have different terms than what we use. And the same thing applies here with learning disorders. So learning disorders, not in the sense that speech language pathologists use different language, but typically school staff, in the educational setting, you might be using slightly different language, but to refer to the same thing. So one thing you'll hear be used interchangeably is the term learning disorder versus learning disability. And we're going to talk more about that in the next slide. But just know within the DSM, we use the term learning disorder. And there's a specific umbrella within the DSM called specific learning disorder in order to describe differences and difficulties in learning and using academic skills. So it is a term used in the education system, ICD, and the DSM, DSM. But again, there's some difference in the term disorder versus disability. Some other just for you to know, like when we're talking about reading, issues in reading, so specific learning disorder with reading impairment. Typically, we're talking about dyslexia, and we're talking about specific learning disorder with impairment in writing, typically dysgraphia, and then in arithmetic is dyscalculia. Um, and so I'm very familiar with the term dyslexia and dysgraphia, but without learning about this, I many years ago wouldn't have known that it fell within the specific learning disorder umbrella. Because again, I think we more colloquially talk about dyslexia without attaching it to specific learning disorders. Okay, so here's that note about disorder versus disability. So again, they're used interchangeably and they're not entirely one and the same. They're technically slightly different. They have slightly different connotations to them. So learning disorder, the word disorder is a term primarily used within the psychological and medical communities. So we think a lot about how psychology, so when we had our first move into psychology, when we talked about Freud and psychoanalysis, it was kind of like its own thing. And then when we started shifting to behaviorism and cognitive behaviorism, we moved towards more of a science model. So trying to operationalize things better because that was a criticism of Freud's psychoanalysis. And so with that, moving to behavior, moving to more clear operationalization, we started falling more closely under the medical model of having a disorder, saying that there's a symptom of or constellation of symptoms, and that's something to be treated. And so it's unsurprising that the word disorder appears both in psychology and medical communities. The word disability is a slightly different term, and it tends to be used within legal or educational communities. So, especially when we're talking about learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, it's really a term to highlight their legal status in terms of the law or the special qualification that they should have for whatever special accommodation they will need in order to ensure equality. So two things that came out of this learning disability, like legal educational movement, is this idea of an IDEA Act, which happened in 2004, and then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So I think later on today we're going to talk a little bit more about what goes in an ID, what the IDEA is and what comes out of it and how that specifically helps kids in the school setting. But I will just say, without having this belief of it as a learning disability, as something to highlight the needs of more, like a to highlight the needs of people who might require more accommodations so that their learning is the equal opportunity as someone else without a learning disability, then we wouldn't have had all of that. One thing, I think something that you may have picked up on by now is that there are a lot of differences in prevalence rates. And a lot of that lies in difference in terms. So like that's what's pointed out here. When we use different terminology, it's hard to pinpoint prevalence rates, like how many people have this disorder. So that impacts just prevalence rates. And also other things like the setting, like where are you asking people? Are you asking people in a clinic? Are you asking people in the community? And so same thing applies here. We're going to have different prevalence rates in part because of this terminology difference. Okay, so that's like just basic terminology, and then remembering that we're going to start talking about DSM disorders, starting with the specific learning disability. Before we even talk about disorders, we need to first be able to identify any learning discrepancies that might be going on. Are there any intellectual components that might be hindering this child's learning? And so there are different approaches for identifying kids with learning disorders. The most traditional, the oldest approach is the ability achievement discrepancy. It's this idea where you give somebody, let's say, an intellectual test. And when I say test, I mean like an assessment battery. So let's say I give them an IQ intelligence test. Um, there's going to be an ability achievement discrepancy in that they may score low, for example, in subdomains of an intelligence test, but their overall achievement maybe is higher. So that's one way there's going to be a discrepancy. It could be the opposite. And so within that discrepancy, we're not just saying, oh, it looks different. What you scored here is different what you scored here. We're specifically looking for a standard deviation of 2 or more. So 2 or more signals to us that it's like if the mean of an intelligence test is 100 points and we think the standard deviation is 10 this way, 10 that way. That means a normal average range would be 90 to 110. If we're scoring 2 standard deviations above that, we're all the way at the tail end if we think of a normal distribution. And so that does signal that there's some significant learning disorder or learning discrepancy happening here if we're having such a large discrepancy. Before I go into the criticisms, I want to show you what what an intelligence test might look like. I can't exit that, and I'm gonna pull up a screen share for you. Okay, I think you can see this now. Okay, switch screens. So the reason I don't have this included in the PowerPoint is this because it's like protected material. So I just want to give you an example of an intelligence test. So this is not for kids necessarily. This isn't like for 5-year-olds. The 5-year-old one would be the WISC, which is a Wechsler exam, and it's intended for children between 5 and I think 16 and like 9 months, something like that. We also have the WAIS, which is the same exact test, but for adults. And then the WASI is like a really short version of the WAIS. So there's many different types of intelligence tests. The most common would be the Wechsler family, and the Wechsler is what the W stands for in all of these: WISC, WAIS, WASI. So this one, again, is not something I would necessarily administer to like a 4-year-old, but it's a shorter version. And so I want to show you this because when we're talking about like, what do you mean a discrepancy? Like, what is that? I don't understand what that means. A difference in what? So this is a practice exam. This is my friend's husband. So we're really looking at, are there differences, like pretty significant differences in these subtests? So like they scored one way on block design, vocab, matrix reasoning. All those things are different subsets of a test of an intellectual disability or an IQ exam, and we might be looking at, is there a pretty big discrepancy between how they scored here and how they scored somewhere else, like on a different subtest or the full scale IQ. Um, so that's like the record form. It's just an example of something to look at so that way you can see we might be looking at, is there a discrepancy between what you scored here in the yellow and here in the yellow, or this one versus the one down here. So there are ways we look at discrepancy based on the different exams that we're going to be using. Is it the intelligence test? Is it a writing test? There's the RAT, W-R-A-T, is more of a like in academic achievement style assessment, and so we might use that one. So there's different ways of looking at discrepancies in learning disorders. And when we talk more about intellectual disabilities on Friday, we'll talk more about this again. I guess I don't have to show you all of this, but this is like an example of what we would have done for vocab. If I were administering a vocab WASI subtest to you, there would be instructions that I read you, and these would be like the things that you would answer. Okay, so going back, so we talked about 2 or more standard deviations. So some sort of discrepancy, and it's a significant discrepancy between overall IQ, so that thing at the bottom in yellow, and specific domains. Now, that is helpful, right? Because we can see in a normal distribution, most people fall in the thick part of the curve. If you're all the way at the tail end, either at one end or the other, that does signal some abnormality. That's one of the ways we thought of abnormality in week 1. So it is helpful for signaling something odd might be happening here, but there's some criticisms to this approach. One of them is that this ability achievement discrepancy requires several discrepancies in order to meet criteria for a learning disability. So if you can imagine, if you need multiple instances of significant discrepancies, that it's just sometimes people don't meet criteria using this approach. It's also based on a flawed or maybe outdated assumption that IQ accurately predicts achievement and represents a person's potential. I won't get into it here, but there's a lot of discourse about like what is the function of IQ? What is it actually supposed to predict? And so recognizing what the strengths and weaknesses are and making sure that IQ is not colloquially being used to like say what a certain person is like or to represent their potential. So IQ is intended to measure a very specific thing, and there are beliefs about what it extrapolates to. But if we're using the weaknesses of that sort of approach, having something like this achievement discrepancy approach where we're saying you are having 2 standard deviations below the mean, that can be associated with some stigma around what that person is like and what their potential may be. The other thing is that intelligence generally tend to rely strongly on language abilities, and that is definitely a criticism of most intelligence tests. So that slide deck that I just showed you with like the goldfish, if you looked further down, there were words. And so that was the vocab subtest where I would have been testing someone on what is their knowledge of different vocabulary words. And so that's a clear indicator of you need to have some sort of language ability in order to even answer those questions. And whether you perform well or poorly on that vocab test will factor into your overall IQ score. And so again, we can see people do really well on the IQ score, or we think their achievement would be much higher, but they're getting like pulled down, their scores are getting pulled lower because of language abilities not being quite high. And for this is in English. And so if you have someone who it's not their first language or they learned it maybe more recently, that also can play a role in, are we actually underestimating kids who may not or may have a communication or learning disability? Other things, it's not sensitive to pick up on early learning problems. So yeah, as I said on Monday, a lot of times it's going to school that's going to flag kids for referral. It's at school where the demands are higher, where they're learning more things, there are more opportunities to demonstrate their comprehension. And on the other hand, if they're having any difficulties, so not being able to like do this ability achievement to standard deviation discrepancy until much later when you do see clear instances of some struggles, let's say third grade versus when they're 4 or 3. That can also be associated with not really serving our kids as well as we can be. Another thing, no way to discriminate between the deficits of the child and of poor instruction. That's a pretty big one. How do we know it's not just your teacher, the person who was teaching you, or your parents? And it misses slower learners. So by slow learners, it means you might just be slow to catch up. It's not actually a learning disorder. It just takes you a little bit longer to process or whatever it is. So it's those without the severe discrepancy. So nonetheless, even though there are all these criticisms about IQ and specifically this 2 standard deviation or more belief, in general, intelligence is still often considered to be required with an intellectual disability, so that we know that the person has low achievement and average intelligence. So there's a difference between, and we'll talk about it on Friday and pull it all together, but there's a difference between intellectual disability and learning disorders. And so what that difference is going to be is if there are specific deficits in particular domains. So let's say I just have poor performance in writing. That might signal a learning disorder, but my IQ overall functioning is much higher. That might indicate it's really a learning disorder and not an overall intellectual disability. Whereas if I did intellectual disability, I might score I am gonna score quite low on the IQ test, and any domain that we're gonna look at is gonna be struggling. So there's a difference, and I'll show you more on Friday. Okay, so what do we do now if we don't really use that previous approach, the ability achievement discrepancy? There are, I think, a couple frameworks put in your book, and I'm only going to highlight this one. So we now use the response to intervention, or RTI model. And the RTI model really came from this commission that happened in 2002. So the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education met in 2002, and they made 3 recommendations. Number 1, focus on results, not process. Number 2, embrace a model of prevention. And number 3, consider children with disabilities as general education first. So, and we'll get more to how that turned into RTI. So that was the recommendation. And from that, RTI was one approach that was born from that. So RTI is a multi-tiered whole school approach that relies on exposing children to intervention prior to making a diagnosis. So intervention before diagnosis versus huge discrepancy. Oh my gosh, you have a diagnosis. Now we're going to intervene with the previous approach. So some of the characteristics of RTI are universal screening, evidence-based teaching practices across the board, monitoring progress, and then having tiered intervention. So we start in one intervention. If someone is struggling, then we move them down to the next tier. But we assume that general education comes first. We start there. I put this picture of Dr. Fletcher. So Dr. Jack Fletcher actually is retired, but he was a neuropsychologist in the Department of Psychology here at UH. And I think that's cool because he was super influential in this President's Commission. So he was really well known when he worked here at UH still. And we had, I mean, it was before my time, like 3 years before I joined the lab or the program, and people were coming all over to specifically be assessed by Dr. Fletcher. So I think cool that we've had some influential people at UH. Okay, I'm gonna play this because I think this explains the tiered intervention a lot better with RTI. And it doesn't work. Okay, so I will show the YouTube version. I was trying to show you guys different things. Okay, so that's that video. I'll update the hyperlink so it's on Canvas, but this is RTI. So quick 2-minute video.
Here, we look at a 3-tiered model, often depicted as a triangle, as one example of how a tiered framework can be used as a school-wide strategy for instructing all students. All students will participate in Tier 1 instruction. At this level, they'll receive effective, differentiated instruction provided by the general classroom teacher as part of an evidence-based core curriculum. The evidence-based instruction offered at this level can be expected to meet the learning needs of 80 to 85% of all students. For students who don't respond adequately to Tier 1 instruction, more intensive interventions come into play. Tier 2 interventions build upon the differentiated instruction provided at Tier 1 by offering students more systematic instruction and interventions strategically designed to help them catch up in areas of difficulty. These interventions are usually delivered to a small group of students within the general classroom, either by the classroom teacher or by another team member supporting the teacher who has also been trained to deliver the interventions. Tier 2 interventions will be offered to the 15% of students for whom Tier 1 instruction was not sufficiently intensive to meet their specific learning needs. But here is a critical point. Students who receive targeted Tier 2 interventions continue to participate in general Tier 1 instruction. Tier 2 interventions do not replace the core curriculum, they supplement it. For example, Dennis has been selected to receive Tier 2 interventions based on the results of recent reading fluency data. He'll continue to participate in the 90 minutes of core reading instruction that is provided to all students in Tier 1 each day. But in addition, he'll spend another 30 minutes per day receiving targeted reading instruction at Tier 2. Under RTI, his opportunities for learning and for catching up to his classmates will have been extended. We've saved the most intensive interventions available for the small percentage of students who still lag significantly behind their peers in making academic gains. Tier 3 interventions supplement the previous tiers by providing the most intensive evidence-based interventions delivered to individual students or in very small groups. Again, the intensity of instruction at this level increases. The size of student groups is reduced, and their opportunities for direct instruction extended. Interventions in Tier 3 may be delivered by an intervention specialist or even a special education teacher. But again, these interventions supplement the instruction provided at Tier 1, not replace it. And students do not have to be identified as disabled in order to receive these interventions. Only about 5% of all students will require these intensive Tier 3 interventions. Of these students, only a portion may go on to require special ed services. As I'm in the midst of applying for residency right now, wish me luck, Grammarly has again been a lifesaver with my application, helping me write my personal statement and CV.
Okay. Any thoughts, questions about RTI? You don't have to. Okay. I will move on, go back to our slides. Stop me if you do have questions. Okay, so we just talked about RTI in that video. I think that's helpful. I think it's more helpful than the textbook, the way it talks about RTI. I think having the visual of the pyramid and like the tiers is helpful and reminding us that like even if you're in tier 3, like certain things don't replace your general education. So that is RTI. And remember, that's in response to the criticism from the ability achievement discrepancy and really came out of that President's Commission recommendations. So keeping in mind, those are the type of interventions then at school that if you are diagnosed with a learning disability, that is the general approach, I would assume, of a school's curriculum for how they're teaching children who have been identified with specific learning disorders, even before they have the diagnosis. That's just generally the model of teaching. Oh yeah, here's just a paper. You don't have to read it, but it's Dr. Fletcher again, like his one of his articles on RTI, and I think it's helpful if you want to know more about it. Like what did they say it is? How is it helpful, and why is it helpful for academic difficulties? If you have any interest. Okay, so that brings us to what are the specific disorders in the DSM? So again, it's an umbrella term, learning disorder, and within that, there are going to be specific impairments. So in general, DSM-5 learning disorders all refer to a specific neurodevelopmental problem in reading, writing, and or arithmetic. So 3 R's or sounds essential to classroom learning and everyday functioning. So the specific diagnosis you would get, according to the DSM, would be specific learning disorder or SLD, and then you would specify what the impairment is in. Which of the 3 R's or the R sounds are we diagnosing? Is it a reading disorder? Is it a math disorder? Or is it a writing disorder? So math would be arithmetic. Reading disorder includes things like dyslexia. So it includes difficulty learning letters, understanding letter sound correspondence, and blending sounds together. And you might notice a child maybe having issues in this reading disorder if you're noticing slower reading compared to other students. In terms of arithmetic or a math disorder, so that includes difficulty processing numerical information. So just things like recognizing the numbers, learning math facts like your times tables or quick arithmetic, things like that, and difficulty with computation and math story problems. Math story problems are those things where you're like, you have a vignette like Mary has 3 apples. John gives her 2 more apples. How many apples does Mary have? Things like that. That's a math story problem. So they're having difficulty with that. Writing disorder would include things of like issues with written expression, so dysgraphia. So a lot of times you can't really make out the words that they're writing. It looks like really weird. So there's some difficulty with, there's a typo there, some difficulty with handwriting and the mechanisms of writing. So spelling, punctuation, what goes in the content, how are they spelling words? So things like that. Across the board, so doesn't matter which of the domains you have an impairment in, these are like the criteria that we would be thinking of. So as always, there's some sort of time specifier. So for here, we need to see at least 6 months worth of difficulties in learning and using academic skills. So at least 6 months. Being impaired skill can be in any of those three R domains, but it doesn't have to be all of them. It can just be one. Symptom onset must occur during the school age years, and that really aligns with when the demands change, when kids go to school, when they're when they have real instruction now with a teacher. And so it makes sense that we want to see it during the school age years. And yet we know that it may not fully manifest until the domain eventually exceeds the person's abilities. So we might see like inklings of dyslexia, right? But if you're 5 years old, learning how to write, that may not fully capture the extent of the dyslexia. We might notice it more when you're 7 years old, 8 years old, when what they can do is not on par with the expectation of people their age. A person's achievement must be substantially lower than for the expected age. So that's that age discrepancy. We said there are some criticisms, but it's still helpful. And so it becomes a criteria. Always need to have some sort of impairment or distress. So it needs to interfere with academic or occupational performance or daily living activities. And again, it can't be explained by some other disorder. So we need to be able to rule out these other things in order to give a diagnosis of SLD. So with the first R, reading, what is SLD with impairment in reading? We often make a distinction between a problem in either word level reading and text level reading or comprehension of written text. So word level reading is dyslexia. It's reading it at a level, reading level by level, like what is the word? So problems in identifying these words or fluently, noticing and being able to read them, poor decoding, so like breaking words into parts, poor spelling abilities, and then the phonological processing always plays a role. Text level reading is different than word level reading. Text level reading has to do with comprehension. So words, can you see the words? Can you notice the words, recognize the words? This other one is text level, like putting it all together. So difficulties understanding what was read. You might also have an impaired ability to make inferences about specific information in the text. And remembering that written word comprehension generally requires that you are competent in the grammatical structure. So that's what we talked about on Monday with communication disorders, like needing to know morphology and syntax. So a lot of times when you have an impairment in communication disorders, it's unsurprising that of a co-occurring disorder tends to be a learning disorder. We can see how those things kind of pair together. And these two types of distinctions that we make in SLD with impairment in reading, a lot of times co-occur together. Developmental course. So generally we see that it's pretty low, like the onset, like the prevalence is always low. It's going to start lowest at your age of like 5, 6. So grade 1 would be 6 years old in the US, I think. And it tends to increase. The prevalence increases as people continue through school and the demands get harder and higher. But not true for all children. I'm going to read this one. The reading disability can also worsen over time. That's known as the Matthew effect, where there's a widening over time of the gap between stronger and weaker readers. So that's this picture on the right-hand side. There's a discrepancy between stronger, like typical readers. That's the one in the orange. And the blue ones are the ones that are weak readers, so people potentially with dyslexia. And so there's already a gap in the reading score. That's the y-axis. And that like that gap looks about the same, but it actually starts widening over time. So this space between the orange and the red gets wider and wider and wider. And that's known as the Matthew effect. In terms of research, and especially in terms of intervention, difficulties in early acquisition of reading tend to be the greatest focus. So um, we notice a lot when kids can't read when they're first learning how to read, start noticing those difficulties. But that's not to say you can't have difficulties emerge later on. So when you're in fourth grade or fifth grade. And so for those type of students who are a little bit older, we would call those late emerging reading disabilities. And so all that to say, it doesn't matter when it is, it's important to identify as soon as you can. Okay, prevalence on reading. I'm not going to read this. They're all pretty across the board, reading, writing, arithmetic, generally in the similar range. And again, just notice the gender difference. Typically, boys have higher rates than girls. Okay, SLD with written expressions, that's your writing. These are the kids that may be late to hand in their work or may sit for hours over homework. And again, we always want to distinguish this between another disorder. We're not talking about like kid who maybe has like repetitive thoughts, like bordering on like OCD level rigidity, like I have to keep writing my name over and over. We're not talking about obsession and compulsions like that. We're also not talking about like anxiety about like needing to be perfect, or if I don't write it this way, will my teacher think I'm stupid? So we're not talking about those things. This is really just having errors in the writing. So because you're having so many errors, because you're having difficulty deciphering what you're trying to write, that's why you're taking a long time on your work. And that's why we may see kids be late to hand in their homework. As usual, persistent difficulties for at least 6 months. And this is important in bold despite the provision of intervention. So even with intervention, we're still seeing some sort of difficulty last much longer. Just like we made a distinction in reading, we also talk about transcription versus text generation difficulties. So transcription is the act of writing, right? So just like copying letters down. It's having to do with your handwriting, your spelling problems. They might produce letters like really slowly and it takes a really long time. So those are difficulties in transcription versus text generation or composition. So that's writing words with intention. Like I'm writing out a sentence, like I'm trying to convey that the dog ran after the ball, right? Like that's composition. And so that's where they will have weak sentence structure, awkward phrasing, not really understanding the goal of their writing. Like I don't really know what I'm writing. So like that execution of developing a plan, organizing the points, monitoring it, linking the ideas together, that's where we see some impairment. Developmental course, I'm going to skip that. Same thing with writing. Yeah. And then we have with math. So that's the last R, that's our arithmetic. And so this refers to problems in basic arithmetic skills, or mathematical reasoning. And again, it's usually disproportionate or developmentally inappropriate. So well below the average for their age range. The type of difficulties you might see deal with number sense, like addition, subtracting, terms and symbols. Again, I mentioned earlier, memorizing like math facts, so your times tables, and demonstrating accurate math reasoning. Um, and we know that like whatever your like physical manifestation is, that the core of it all is having a poor sense of numbers, and then cognitive abilities are typically tied with that. I'm going to skip developmental course and prevalence. We talked about this kind of earlier, that they tend to cluster very closely with communication disorders and other learning disorders. So again, it's not surprising if you have SLD with writing impairment, it's not a surprise if you also have dyslexia, reading impairment. So very common to have co-occurring disorders with that, also with ADHD and some externalizing problems. I'm gonna skip this part. It's in your textbook, and honestly, I think it's helpful for just your knowledge of SLD, but it's not on the test. But this is just when we're thinking about the impact of a disorder of within oneself, what is the impact on your environment? So when you're struggling in school, you may have poor peer poor peer support. If you're having to stay after class because the teacher has to talk to you because you took so long to turn something in because you're having an issue in writing or math, that takes away time from recess with your peers. Not being with your peers causes a strain on peer relationships. Having a strain on your peer relationships may impact your internal sense of self. Like, nobody likes me, I don't have any friends. You may also think that your friends think you're not very smart. So it has a lot of implications for the potential negative consequences. And so we want to think about what are all the different factors that we should think about when we are treating someone with an SLD, because we want to know how does this impact them in their everyday life. So things like having a low or poor sense of control, if that's something that has happened because of this, as a consequence of this disorder, that might be something to target in treatment. And also just at home to help buffer, like help ensure that like they're not stupid. You don't, it's not that nobody likes you, right? Things like that. So that's an important few pages just to read about that. Etiology, I guess you can read this here. There's always going to be some sort of genetic influence, neurobiological, and then the environment, psychosocial. Um, I think this is interesting that the reading heritability rates tend to be pretty high. I can't remember what the specific percentage is, but tends to be high. And then there's very little out there on the genetic influences of writing and math, so heritability between family members. Brain structure and brain function, I won't read that. It's in your textbook, but there seems to be some sort of differences in brain structure and function. And again, it's not like set in stone. Like these are just studies that have been done, imaging like their brains after identifying like that they have SLD. And then psychosocial influences. I think this is an interesting one too. Again, it's not a parent's fault. It's a correlated risk factor with whether or not a parent reads to their child at night. Whether when a child is speaking, do you correct the speech or do you try to enhance the speech? That's going to be really different than a parent maybe who, for whatever reason, could be stressed, maybe they're at work, they just don't see their child because they're working so much. That opportunity to correct speech or to read at night with the child to help bolster and scaffold that ability is maybe not there when they're busy at work, maybe, or maybe they have like a nanny. And so that's something that can also influence maybe the maintenance of SLD. And same thing with quality of instruction and class size. Uh, we won't talk about assessment of communication and learning disorders. It's in your book, but it's basically more on like intelligence testing and like learning ability when we look at academic achievement, stuff like that. This is important though. So like what is the intervention? So we talked about RTI, but where does specific learning disorder also fall within other disciplines? So there are different like models and conceptual foundations around it. And then this one. So what then do we do with special education? What happens when you do need accommodations? This is in your textbook, and I think you should know about IDEA, the IDEA Act, and IEP, which is your individual education plan, and what is in an IEP. What are the benefits and concerns? What are some things that you may be granted with an IEP? So these are members of the IEP plan team. And these are the things they might be doing. Like these are their roles in order to ensure that a child has the best outcomes, that they have equal opportunity to learn as their peers without whatever disorder or impairment they may be having. So I'll leave you to read that. But I want to show you two videos on the IDEA Act and the IEP plan. Okay, before I do that, any questions? Okay, this also if you look at the like person who posted it, it's International OCD Foundation, but I think the person who's doing it, so Eric Storch is a big pediatric OCD person who will watch more stuff about when we go to the OCD section or the OCD chapter, I think around the anxiety chapter that we read in a few weeks. And he is also based in Houston at TCH, or no, Baylor Medical College. So I think that's helpful to also know if you're interested in thinking about research or like people who are here in the Houston area. Eric Storch is also a pretty big name. Okay, and here he is explaining what this act is. I think it's super important if you're ever going to interact with kids, especially school age children, if you have children of your own, siblings, clients that you work with who are going to be kids, you don't have to be super, super well versed, but I find that when I'm like totally unaware, like I need to know what an IEP plan is. Sometimes the therapist might get called in if it's helpful at all. It's not necessary, but sometimes the therapist can speak to the things that they're working on or their impression of a child. Especially like with ADHD, I think is a good example of suggesting some accommodations that could be helpful and might be discussed in the team meeting. So helpful to know, even if you're not in the education system. Okay, this is the act explained.
Back in 1975, the federal government established an educational act, which now is known as IDEA, Individual with Disabilities Education Act. Now, the whole goal of this program or this initiative is that children are able to receive free, appropriate education within a public setting. And importantly, that parents have a voice in their child's education. Now, there are a number of rights that families have with regards to their child's education that's specific to individuals with OCD as well as other disabilities. Now, in order to qualify for IDEA, the child must have a documented disability with also a documentation of impairment that's taking place or occurring within the school setting across a number of domains. The simple presence of a disability doesn't necessarily allow the child to have received services, but with those two things together, there is that opportunity.
Great. The new GoDaddy Arrow has AI marketing tools to help small businesses easily reach out.
Okay. Okay, that was the end. Okay, that's the act. I think, again, always remembering it's not about like stigmatizing or saying like because you have this disability like you have to be in special education. It's not meant to other or to stigmatize. It's to do the opposite, to make sure that they have equal opportunity. So if I'm someone without any, I'm going to use ADHD as an example, I have no impairments in attention or deficits, or I have a normative amount. And I don't need any special preferences. I don't really need to sit in the front of the class. I can manage myself in the back, or I can turn in my assignments on time. That's great for me. And if I hold someone else to the same standard, knowing that there's a neurodevelopmental disability happening like ADHD, that then puts this child with ADHD at a disadvantage. So we want to ensure that they have equal opportunity to learn just as well, to have the same outcomes. So whereas I may not need to sit in the front of the class because I have strong executive functioning skills. I can sit in the back. I can take notes. I can write my stuff down. It may be helpful for the child with ADHD to maybe sit closer in front of class so that there are fewer distractions. There's stronger opportunity for instructor to maybe interact with the child more often, like to help to redirect. So I think that might be helpful. And then also extra time and a half on tests. So getting a little bit extra time to account for maybe it takes a little bit longer to read or to process the information on the test than it would for me. So all about providing equal opportunities so that they can learn at the same rate or learn with the same outcomes. Okay, last thing. So I think you guys can read about the IEP plan. I had a video queued up, but I mean, do you guys have a strong preference? Do you want to see it's the same guy, Eric Storch. It's another 3-minute video. We can end early or you guys can watch it. What do you want to do? I might just share it in the chat and then you guys can watch it. Okay, we can watch it. Great. It's only a 3-minute video. And it went away. Shoot. Okay, it's Eric Storch. Let me pull it up again. Whether or not you know like exactly what's an IEP, like that's not what I care about in the exam. It's just, do you know what an IEP is? What's the point of it? And like what are some of the things you might accomplish in an IEP? So okay, in that case, I will play it. Okay, more share, and that's the last video.
You're prepared, you have the meeting scheduled, and you're ready to go. I think there are 5 kind of points that also are really helpful during the meeting. One of these first points is to remember that you are key. You're important, if not the most important person in your child's life. This process cannot take place without you. The school is not able to move without you. So remember that your values, your beliefs, and opinions are critical to this process moving forward. The second piece is have an advocate with you. That can be a spouse, a good friend, an educational consultant, but someone that also has a stake in your child's well-being and education. At the same time, let the school know who that person is and why they're going to be coming. If you present at a meeting with a stranger with you, oftentimes schools can quite naturally become defensive, and it takes a little bit of focus on your child. With some simple notice saying, hey, I want this person there to make sure I don't forget anything or to help me articulate some of my ideas, it really alleviates that type of concern. A third really important thing is to personalize your child. Sometimes these meetings end up focusing on numbers and school-based data and so on, and that's important. But at the end of the day, your child's a child. So recognizing his strengths, for example, that they're a great soccer player, they love piano, noting their friends, their relationships, their performance. At the same time, in a context of being firm, but yet as positive as one can be. This is one way to make sure that your child is viewed as a child and that data converges to help support any sort of educational plan. A fourth point is to make sure that you focus on the big picture. What I mean by that is that there's going to be a discussion thereafter on how do we achieve these goals. That discussion is really important. But we're starting on, okay, what are the goals here? What am I trying to seek out and ensure happens? That's really the big picture at play. From there, the actual methods of achieving those goals comes back in, but you really want to make sure that you're focusing large before you get a little bit more refined and narrow. And then a final point is this idea that you don't have to complete everything that day. In fact, across the board, I really encourage families to take home any documentation provided by the school. Spend a night, read it, think about it, talk about it with, again, a loved one or an advocate to get some perspective. If revisions are required, they're substantial, may involve a secondary meeting. If they're more minor revisions or none at all, then usually it's able to be processed much more quickly and effectively. But at the end of the day, it's about taking your time because this is really a key meeting, which you're a key part of it as a parent. But making sure that you're in agreement with the document and the plan as put forth.
Oh my God, I just won $60,000 from my car crash from this app from my phone.
Okay. That's the last video. Any last, I'm off camera. Any like last impressions, thoughts, questions about what we're covering next or on Friday? Okay. I think if you are, yeah, I said it earlier, but I think if you have any interaction with kids who require some extra assistance, I think it's helpful to just know what's happening. And especially if you end up being a clinician. So I've had clients, parents ask me, do you think I should say anything in the meeting? So I think to the best of your ability that you can advocate or help coach maybe a parent through it, that's super helpful. I have a team that I work with right now. doesn't have learning disabilities, but has missed a full year of school and is finally like trying to make up her work. Had some pretty significant like emotional behavioral dysregulation, purging a lot at school. So we just missed a lot of school. And so she has these meetings. And I think another thing I would say is the older your kids get, they usually, because I feel like accommodations are stupid sometimes, that's a generalization, but they like don't speak up in these meetings and they can when they're 14, 15, 16, you're in high school. And so I think as a therapist, if you are ever going to get pulled into this type of stuff with IEP meetings, like you can ask, like, is it helpful if I'm there? I can speak to why this accommodation would be helpful, or like, does it helpful if I talk to the teacher? So offering yourself can also be one way to find your way into this kind of context. So I've offered, like, is it helpful for me to coach you through like what we've talked about, what could be helpful? Is it helpful if I'm there? If you want me there, I think you need to tell the school I'll be there the next meeting. So things like that. Like I haven't sat in an actual IEP meeting, but I've come close to it many times. And this is not even as like an educator. It's literally just because I work with the kid in therapy, and I think it's helpful, and I want them to request accommodations. So thinking I was not planning, like I didn't know that I could have that much potential influence as a clinician without being someone in education. So I think that could be interesting for some people if you have any interest in that. Okay, it's 9:55. If no other questions, I'll see you guys on Friday and we'll cover intellectual disabilities. Okay. Recording.